Welcome to the second of our series of deep dives on draft Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. Ko Amelia Sharma Tokuingoa, Director Sustainability Reporting, and joining me today in order of appearance are Lisa Kelsey, Jack Bissett, Judy Ryan and Steph Gray. Deep dive is to clearly explain the proposed in the exposure drafts, so as with any areas that you consider need further attention by the XRB board. Now, before we dive in, we just have a quick poll for you. So I will just launch the poll. So the question is, which of the following best describes you? This is a useful question for us because then we can understand more about your information needs. Votes coming in. Excellent. A few more last ones. All right. So we've got mostly preparers and some regulators, others, and consultants. So hopefully you can see all those answers on the screen. So thanks so much. Really great to see a couple of users here as well. So we will get on now with the rest of the presentation. All right, so as I'm assuming you all know, the XRB is proposing that the climate-related disclosure framework, as enabled by legislation, is made up of 3 climate standards, which are collectively referred to as Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. Each draft standard is a piece of secondary legislation, and we really want to emphasise the importance of the standards being read together as a package. Today's deep dive is focused on the exposure drafts of Nzcs 1 and Nzcs 2, paying particular attention to examples and issues relevant for non-financial climate reporting entities, so our listed debt and equity issuers. We will address questions at intervals throughout the presentation, so please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and do please get them in early so we can make sure we get to them. However, if we get deluged with questions and we don't get to yours today, we will respond to it after the event. If you missed our deep dive on Nzcs 3 on the 9th of August, we have a recording available on our website, so I really encourage you to watch that if you didn't participate in that event. Now, before we get into the specifics, I'm going to cover the objective, scope, and effective date of draft Nzcs 1. In providing a consistent framework for entities to consider the climate-related risks and climate-related opportunities that climate change presents for their activities over the short, medium, and long term, the objective of Nzcs 1 is to enable primary users to assess the merits of how entities are considering those risks and opportunities, and then make decisions based on these assessments. The ultimate aim is to support the allocation of capital towards activities that are consistent with the transition to a low emissions, climate resilient future. The scope section of a standard sets out which entities a standard applies to. Nzcs 1 applies to those entities which are required by the Financial Markets Conduct Act 2013 to prepare climate statements or group climate statements that comply with the climate-related disclosure framework. If you are unsure whether you are a climate reporting entity, please do get independent legal advice. And then if there is any remaining uncertainty, please do check with the FMA. Now, the XRB board can issue standards that apply to interim periods. However, for the avoidance of any doubt, the XRB board has clarified in paragraph 4 of Nzcs 1 that it does not apply to interim periods. And any entity that elects to, voluntarily, or is otherwise directed to prepare climate-related disclosures is encouraged to apply all the requirements of Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. So to avoid, for example, cherry-picking just 1 or 2. In Nzcs 1, Appendix B sets out the effective date of the standard. The proposed effective date is annual reporting periods beginning on or after 1 January 2023. Gone a bit too fast. So if your entity has a March balance date, your first climate-related disclosures will be for the year end 31 March 2024. And if your entity has a June balance date, then your first climate-related disclosures will be for the year ended 30 June 2024. In today's deep dive, we're going to work through the 4 sections governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets, and also assurance of greenhouse gas emissions of Nzcs 1 with you. But before we start on the 4 sections, I'm going to hand over to Lisa to provide an overview of what's in Nzcs 2.
Thanks, Amelia. The XRB board is proposing mostly one-year exemptions across 3 topics: strategy, metrics and targets, and an Nzcs 3 comparative information. These are areas where it either makes logical sense for entities to be given exemptions, such as comparatives and analysis of trends, or which represent more complicated areas for disclosure, such as Scope 3 GHG emissions. The way the first-time adoption standard works is that an entity elects to use one or more of the adoption provisions contained in draft Nzcs 2. Paragraph 25 of Nzcs 2 requires that if an entity elects to use any of the first-time adoption provisions, it must include a description of the adoption provisions used in conjunction with its statement of compliance. As the title of the standard suggests, these provisions are available to an entity the first time it adopts Aotearoa New Zealand climate standards. So these adoption provisions are available to those 200-odd entities who are currently captured by the regime. But if at any point an entity becomes a climate reporting entity, by virtue of the fact that it meets the criteria in the Act, as a first-time adopter, that entity may apply the first-time adoption provisions. However, it is important to note that if an entity drops out of the regime to only re-enter a few years later, the XRB board's view is that that entity should not be able to take advantage of the first-time adoption provisions again. And paragraph 4 of the scope section sets this out. As we work through the proposed requirements in Nzcs 1, we will identify which disclosures have first-time adoption provisions. You will see a little smiley face icon. As we have previously communicated, the proposed disclosures are based on the TCFD recommendations and have been informed by the exposure drafts issued by the International Sustainability Standards Board. Today, we are not going to discuss how each of the XRB's proposed requirements align with the TCFD or the ISSB. However, we have prepared comparison tables both to the TCFD and the ISSB. These are available on our website. Each standard is accompanied with what is known as a basis for conclusions. These will be familiar to users of accounting and audit and assurance standards. But for those of you new to standards, the basis for conclusion is intended to provide useful explanations of the XRB board's decision-making process during the standards development. We encourage you to read these. We are now going to work through the contents of the 4 sections in Nzcs 1. The 4 sections in Nzcs 1 all follow a consistent format. Each section contains a disclosure objective, overarching disclosure requirements, followed by sub-disclosures where needed. First up are the proposed governance disclosures. In October 2021, the XRB board consulted on a proposed governance section of draft Nzcs 1. The main changes between the first consultation round and the exposure draft are summarised on page 16 of the consultation document. I will highlight these changes as we work through the governance section. The objective of the governance disclosures is to enable primary users to understand both the role an entity's governance body plays in overseeing climate-related risks and opportunities, and the role management plays in assessing and managing those climate-related risks and opportunities. Such information supports evaluations of whether climate-related risks and opportunities receive appropriate attention from the governance body and management. The quality of governance structures and functions are primary factors in determining whether an entity can successfully identify, analyse, and manage its climate-related risks and opportunities. The governance section has 3 overarching disclosure requirements, 2 of which contain sub-disclosures. Following feedback from the first round of consultation, the XRB board agreed with respondents that we should use a more generic term, and hence we have moved away from TCFD language of board to a more general term of governance body. We have also added a disclosure, as you can see on screen, as the identity of the governance body responsible for climate-related risks and opportunities. This disclosure enables an entity to describe the body with the ultimate responsibility for climate-related risks and opportunities. There are 4 sub-disclosures for governance body oversight. We'll just quickly run through these. There is the processes. Next slide, thank you. Processes and frequency. Can we go back to governance body oversight slide? Thank you. We have the processes and frequency for informing the governance body. This is unchanged from our earlier consultation. Appropriate skills and competencies. In its earlier consultation, the XRB proposed a disclosure focusing on where the board assesses expertise on climate-related issues, either from its own capacity or from external sources. We received feedback, in particular from investor bodies, who wanted the XRB to strengthen this disclosure. We are now proposing how the body ensures the appropriate skills and competencies are available to provide oversight. In the early years of the regime, this disclosure might simply reflect an entity's process of capacity building and the development of competencies that had not previously been a focal area. The third sub-disclosure is how the body considers when climate-related risks and opportunities when overseeing implementation of an entity's strategy. This has also been changed since the earlier consultation to focus on the role the governance body has in developing and overseeing an entity's strategy, rather than disclosures on how climate-related risks and opportunities are incorporated into governance processes. And then finally, we have how the governance body monitors progress. This disclosure is an amalgamation of earlier proposals, and it also clarifies that the disclosure of performance metrics is a whether and if so, how disclosure. There are 3 sub-disclosures under the management's role in assessing and managing climate-related risks. Next slide. These sub-disclosures focus on who and how climate-related risks and opportunity management, where delegated responsibilities lie within the entity, and how often management is involved. That's it for the proposed governance disclosures. Amelia, I don't know if we have any questions at this point.
We have a couple of questions that have come in, none specific on governance, so we'll hold those questions. Thank you very much for those who put those in, and then we will move on to the next. But I would like to say, even though we haven't had any questions on governance, it's a really important part of the disclosures. We really think from our stakeholder research and engagement, we're really aware that this is an area that primary users want information on. So yeah, please do make sure you understand those disclosure requirements on governance. All right, moving on. Thank you very much, Lisa. Okay, next ones are Jack to take us through the proposed strategy disclosures. Over to you, Jack.
Thanks, Amelia. Kia ora koutou. Good morning, everybody. So this section of the presentation outlines our proposed strategy disclosures, which have been amended following feedback we received in our previous consultation round. Thanks to all of you who provided us with feedback. This section is about your core business model and strategy. It's fundamentally about what your entity is trying to achieve and how. This is not about having a separate climate strategy. It's about answering for your primary users, how will climate change impact you, and how you're positioning your business model and strategy in anticipation of transformational changes to the world around you. Primary users are increasingly expecting that an entity can back claims that their business model and strategy are resilient to climate change. Therefore, the strategy section of NZCS 1 requires an entity to cover quite a broad range of issues. And so there is a lot in this section as reflected in that upfront objective for the strategy section. So for instance, an entity must demonstrate that it understands the risks and opportunities it is exposed to, the scenario analysis undertaken, the current and anticipated impacts of climate change, and the financial impacts, and the transition plan aspects of your strategy. So those make up the 4 key disclosure headings. So there have been 2 key changes at this high level to the strategy section. The new structural component on the far right, which is titled How the Entity Will Position Itself, and that creates a 4th high-level disclosure that we didn't previously have. And this is where the transition plan aspects of the strategy are contained. And we've also done some reordering on the left to better reflect the process that preparers go through, and also influenced by the structure of the ISSB's proposed strategy section. So moving on and moving through these 4 high-level disclosure areas, firstly is current impacts and financial impacts. Primary users want insight into how climate change currently affects an entity. And this is an area where there is an increasing focus. Given we live in a world that already includes 1.1 degrees of warming, given the significant and ongoing extreme weather events that we're seeing, and the changing societal and political factors we already live with now, primary users now want to see evidence that entities understand what this means for their business model and strategy, and their most recently reported financial position and performance. As noted by the IPCC, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred. So for instance, you might have been forced, getting down to within an organization like one that you're in, you may have been forced to change aspects of your operations, alter your priorities, adjust your perspectives on what can and cannot be controlled through the value chain due to physical and transition impacts. You're not required, however, in this part of the standard to calculate what portion of a climate-related impact was attributable to climate change. So for example, with flood damage, can be considered an impact resulting from climate. There is no need to attribute what proportion of the impact of a given flood event resulted from climate change above and beyond a business usual flood event. Cross-industry metrics that Judy will touch on later provide a useful starting point in identifying these current financial impacts. We suggest that you begin qualitatively and build in quantification over time. Quantification is likely to be a range in these cases, and in many cases a broad range subject to a high level of uncertainty. We've proposed a 1-year first-time adoption provision for financial impacts if you want to take up this option. But also note that for some impacts, they may not be able to be precisely quantified. And if that's the case, you can make use of the 3rd disclosure there and disclose qualitative information coupled with an explanation as to why quantification was not possible. So that is a new disclosure. Moving on to scenario analysis, primary users are interested in understanding the scenario analysis process you have followed and what the core assumptions underpinning the analysis were, and whether these align with those used by your peers. So this includes now at least 3 scenarios, a 1.5 degrees scenario, 3 degrees or greater scenario, and a 3rd scenario where the temperature outcome is up to you to choose. So following feedback that we received previously, we've increased the minimum number of scenarios up from 2 to 3. We've increased the upper bound temperature outcome from greater than 2 degrees to greater than 3 degrees. And this was in response to concerns that we heard that the 2 degrees temperature outcome we had previously on the higher end physical risk wouldn't be sufficient, and there wouldn't be enough exploration of higher physical risk scenarios. And also that if we only had 2 scenarios that were required, then this would set it up so that entities were seeing a good and a bad scenario, as opposed to seeing all of the scenarios as plausible futures to explore. We're not proposing any first-time adoption provisions for scenario analysis, despite some feedback asking for this. We think that scenario analysis can be conducted by any entity immediately, as there is no requirement to quantify the outcomes of scenarios using complex quantitative models or the like. Scenario analysis is first and foremost a tool of strategic thinking and we believe all entities are capable of that in this regime. We've published guidance on how to get started at the sector level for scenario analysis, and also a fact sheet clarifying the definition and purpose of scenario analysis under this framework, and those are both available on our website. So, getting a little deeper into the swimming pool now, as I touched on, scenario analysis, it's a process for systematically exploring the effects of a range of plausible future events under conditions of uncertainty. The primary purpose of scenario analysis in this context is to test the resilience of the entity's business model and strategy to those multiple scenarios. Given we do not know as a global society which scenario will eventuate, this means an entity can begin to think about how will we build resilience into our business model and strategy, given that any one of these scenarios could plausibly play out. In doing so, climate-related risks and opportunities themselves are also typically identified, which then feeds into the wider disclosure process. So as I touched on, earlier in the year, the XRB has been reaching out to sectors to encourage entities to start on scenario analysis at the sector level. Many sectors are already doing this, and further sectors continue to start collaborative projects in this area, and we're very excited about these developments. We encourage everyone to try and stay across what's happening in their sector, even if they're not intimately involved in that type of work. The reason that we've encouraged this type of sectoral collaboration is because, this translation of high-level information from that top cone on the left about global patterns of change, all the way down to you as an individual entity, it is a lot of work, and sector level collaboration can help to ensure that that translation is done in a more consistent way and more efficiently than having all entities doing it separately and individually. That means that what we're trying to help CREs to do is to avoid the situation on the left and move them towards the situation on the right-hand side, which we believe will also result in more consistent disclosures within and across sectors. So this is not a mandatory part of the standard, but it is a helpful way for entities to meet it. And we also think that investors are increasingly going to want to see consistency and comparability across sectors and within sectors over time. So a quick status update. This is broadly speaking where we understand things are at with the different sectors getting started on scenario analysis at a sector level. So the marine sector, they basically put a piece of work through and completed their scenario analysis back in 2020. The general insurers have also completed a collaborative project earlier this year. And then we have tourism, banking, buildings and materials, and agriculture also taking the dive now. Other sectors below that are still in the planning stages, with some encouraging developments among the MIS managers, healthcare, retail, and other conversations continuing as well. Okay, moving on now to the climate-related risks and opportunities. So this is a core piece of information in the strategy section, is your climate-related risks and opportunities. So along with that, you need to explain how you've defined short, medium, and long term in relation to those risks and opportunities, and how these link to your strategic planning and investment processes. You must describe when you anticipate the financial impacts from each of these risks and opportunities will occur, and also effectively categorize them as either physical or transition risks. You also need to be able to describe how climate-related risks and opportunities serve as an input into financial planning processes, including for capital deployment and funding. So again, we have the first-time adoption provision for those wishing to use it for the financial impact aspect of this section. So what are climate-related risks and opportunities? Hopefully everybody's well and truly across this foundational type of information by now, but just to run through it for anyone who may be a bit newer on the scene, physical risks and opportunities arise due to the physical impacts of climate change. So these can be event-driven or acute, such as the increased severity of extreme weather events that I touched on earlier. They can also relate to longer-term shifts, which are chronic, things like changes in precipitation and temperature, and increased variability in weather patterns. Transition risks and opportunities on the right, they arise due to the transition to a lower emissions, climate-resilient global and domestic economy. So things like policy and legal risks, technology and market, and reputational risks. We have updated the definition of transition risk to clarify that this includes, this idea of a transition to a low emissions, but also a climate resilient economy. So trying to more accurately capture the mitigation and adaptation components under the idea of transition, rather than maybe previously people were thinking about adaptation being on the left-hand side of this picture. But as societies respond and anticipate climate change, that distinction is increasingly moving away, and we're moving to this understanding where transition encapsulates the building of resilience within communities and societies and economies. So we would expect these risks and opportunities to be disclosed in a way that is specific to the entity in more detail than they appear here. So jumping into a few examples, first one of the day is ZESPRI. So these examples are from existing voluntary disclosures. I did my best to try and find some examples from some pool supplies manufacturers to bring some more diving related puns to you today. However, I couldn't find any, unfortunately, but as soon as they do, we will be sure to start using them. So these disclosures, as I said, which are voluntary, and all the other ones that we have in this presentation, these were made under a voluntary regime, not necessarily with our standards in mind. So we're only showing them as a way to basically communicate the type of information that we would generally expect to be disclosed. However, we don't endorse these disclosures as a format or a sort of template, nor have we reviewed everything else that is in the rest of their reports. So that aside, so this is ZESPRI's example for their risk side of the spectrum, and they have both separated into physical and transition, and effectively laid this out in a what I'm sure they think is a clear way, which also has the different scenarios there with 2 and 4 degree temperature outcomes and some different information for primary users there. And on the right-hand side, some different environmental regulation, and then other consumer preference issues coming through there on the risk side. When it comes to opportunities, this is what they've disclosed as well. So physical opportunities arising from things like these warmer temperatures, longer growing seasons in some regions, potentially resulting in higher quality fruit for ZESPRI and yield. And then on the right-hand side, again, these consumer preference changes and policy changes, bringing both positives and negatives for the future for ZESPRI. Okay, so moving on now to the anticipated impacts and financial impacts of climate change. So these are intended to inform a primary user's view of the entity's attractiveness as an investment option. It's important that preparers bear in mind that this information, again, need not be precise to be relevant, and in many cases it can and should remain broadly expressed using ranges. To help give a sense of the scope, the TCFD consider that the factors affecting an entity's financial, basically the financial impacts from climate change, include 3 key prongs. So this is the entity's exposure to and the anticipated effects of those specific climate-related risks and opportunities we just talked about. Next is the entity's planned response to manage its risks and seize opportunities, and then the implications of those responses on its financial position, performance, and cash flows. So it is a bit of a multi-dimensional idea, financial impacts. Again, we have proposed a 1-year exemption from disclosing the anticipated financial impacts for any entities that want to take this up, recognizing that this is a fast-moving area and one of the areas where preparers are only just starting to get into it more and more at the moment. Okay, so in another example from Meridian. So this is an example cited by the TCFD, really in the context of anticipated financial impacts. So you can see here the Meridian disclosing information about what they've called a physical risk, long-term, out 30 years there, increasing intensity of extreme rainfall events and hydro catchments. And then they've also provided information there about the anticipated financial impacts in both qualitative and quantitative form. So we have heard feedback along the way about this concern with the disclosure of confidential information, and these concerns have been raised with the TCFD, with other standard setters internationally, particularly regarding the disclosure of opportunities in the strategy section. So we think that ourselves and the TCFD are clear that entities can't use business confidentiality as a reason for avoiding disclosure altogether. However, judgment will be required as to the level of granularity of disclosures in this area. So in exercising that judgment, we have guidance on this in our proposed staff guidance, which largely aligns with what the TCFD has already said on this, which is to have regard for these points here and start by disclosing broader, more qualitative information and move to more specific information over time. But the disclosure should be as specific as the entity deems to be practically and commercially possible. So they should not be unnecessarily broad. So now the fourth new high-level disclosure that we've added since last time around how the entity will position itself. And this is really trying to get at, from a primary user perspective, how will the entity strategically position itself in the context of the global and domestic transition to a low emissions, climate resilient economy? And primary users really want to see evidence about how the entity will thrive in a world which is attempting to rapidly reduce its emissions and adapt to the unavoidable consequences of climate change. So acknowledging these challenges while setting out a coherent case for how they can be overcome. This helps to provide primary users comfort that their investments are resilient to climate-related risk. This is where the disclosure around the business model and strategy comes through. So we received predominantly positive feedback on this in our last round of consultation. Again, here we're just looking for a brief description that summarizes the business model and strategy. Could include something like a simple diagram of your business model and a short paragraph describing the key aspects of your strategy. There is, again, an optional 1-year exemption for disclosing the transition plan aspects of your strategy. However, at the same time, we would reiterate there is a lot of pressure coming on transition planning from investors globally, and we only expect this pressure to grow over time. Okay, so when it comes to these transition plans, last time when we consulted on this, we proposed that there'd be the separate disclosure of transition plans on the left, adaptation plans on the right on that diagram there. And that was really aligning with the TCFD's recommendations. However, we are no longer proposing the separate disclosure of these adaptation plans. The reason for that is that since we proposed that, global standard setters have made proposals in this area and they've effectively proposed a transition plan that integrates adaptation actions within it. We've also had in New Zealand, the Climate Leaders Coalition update their member statement, and they have also integrated mitigation and adaptation components in what they call a climate action plan. We also received some feedback from CREs who did not really want to see us provide a longer lead-in time for adaptation plans, and they were worried that therefore adaptation wouldn't be integrated into the same plan as the plan to reduce emissions, and they'd also be delayed and seen as less important. So this is an important change in scope and definition of transition plan to be aware of. So we've now proposed this definition on the right, which emphasizes again this idea that we're transitioning to a climate resilient economy, and we'd expect adaptation information to be included in the transition plan disclosures. So moving on now to the picture of basic guidance around transition plans and what's happening globally. So it is a very busy picture with a lot happening at the moment on this. And so what we have on the left, we have standards being developed on transition plans by organizations beyond ourselves, including the ISSB, the US Securities and Exchange Commission, which, as I said, has been influencing the disclosure rules on that we're proposing on transition plans, but also there's a lot of guidance coming out and more coming through from investor groups like the Investor Group on Climate Change for entities in our context, and then also others like the Global Financial Alliance on Net Zero, pointing more at the financial institutions, and then others including CDP, TCFD, and then the UK Transition Plan Task Force set up over the last 6 months or so to try and get some more consistency around transition plan frameworks effectively. So this is a very busy, fast-moving space at the moment. And then, as I mentioned, New Zealand also voluntary commitments, which are partly aligning with some of this international information. So as we look at this, one thing that we're conscious of is that there is a rapidly rising expectation within these transition plans that you effectively can demonstrate to your primary users that you're on a 1.5 degrees aligned pathway, and that, to be able to demonstrate that, there's this demand for information that works at effectively a global level, then a national and a sector level, through the presence of ambitious long-term emissions reduction targets, interim targets, and then credible actions about how you're going to deliver on those targets and other aspects such as engagement. So what we're doing at the moment, we have a little bit of guidance on this in the proposed staff guidance that we've just released, but we're also developing further guidance, trying to basically integrate the mitigation and adaptation components more so than exists out there at the moment, to really help ensure that entities can develop a transition plan that in an efficient and integrated way, which is not easy. Okay, so an example of a transition plan. So this is an example of Nestle cited by the TCFD. So the way they've developed this and laid this information out is effectively a clear roadmap out to 2050, with a set of plans and actions in the middle there about how they're going to reduce emissions as the world's largest food and beverage company. And as you can see at the top left there, this includes sort of strategic positioning changes to embrace the need and their role in regenerating nature for future generations, as a key part of what they're doing. So it's not just the sort of separate list of actions they're going to take to reduce emissions, but a strategic repositioning as well. Okay, so now for another controversial example, just to keep them interesting. So following a pretty well-known scandal, we have this Volkswagen effectively transition plan, or again, change in strategy. And so, they're pointing out here that their view is that the world of mobility will change fundamentally by 2030, and electric drive and fully networked transport with autonomous drive will increasingly determine how we move around in the future. So based on this view, Volkswagen is making basically fundamental changes to its business model and strategy, seeking to transform itself from a traditional basically seller of internal combustion engine cars to a software-driven mobility provider, as they communicate it. So they're effectively acknowledging as part of this that their revenue will change between now and 2030 from the sale of conventional combustion engine vehicles to zero emissions electric cars, but also in the background from vehicle sales to software and mobility services. So underneath that, there's a real need for them to basically accelerate the adoption of new technology and data driven approach to how they basically sell cars and run their business. So again, whilst setting a net zero emissions reduction target aligned with 1.5 degrees, developing actions to meet these targets may be the first port of call. Once entities have these kinds of things in place, investors are increasingly also wanting to see evidence that these things are integrated into your core business model and strategy. Otherwise, there can be concern that there are separate plans that with different priorities. So the core business model and strategy over on one side, and the climate actions over here. Investors want to see that that's one story, and that is actually being integrated within the entity itself. Okay, Amelia, how are we going for questions?
Brilliant. Thank you, Jack. That was a really good overview of what's in. I think as you said at the beginning, there is a lot in there. We do have one question that's come through on governance. So I'll just answer that one first, which is, how is the governance structure going to be, I think it says ensured, but I think that might be assured by third parties. Is there going to be an example scheme to be used? So firstly, assurance is only required of the greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. Judy is going to get into that later. So there's no mandatory assurance required over other parts of the climate statements. And is there an example scheme to be used? We are really keen, well, the disclosures require that the entity discloses how governance works in its own entity. So there is no, the XRB is not saying that governance should look like XYZ. It's really about the entity explaining to its primary users how is governance over climate-related risks and opportunities operationalized in its own entity. You know, if what is the particular governance body, how does it work in the entity itself? So no, there is not going to be any best practice examples about how governance should work issued by the XRB. Right, so Jack, we do have some good questions. So is there going to be a base scenario, no changes required for comparison purposes? So really as a baseline.
Good question. So I guess one thing that the scenario analysis process does, I believe, is to really encourage entities to explore multiple different plausible climate futures that we face, from that 1.5 degrees globally ambitious emissions reduction type scenario where we see less physical impacts, to the other side of the spectrum where we see delayed climate action and we see high physical impacts. So what is the idea of a default? Where's the baseline in that? There is no longer really a baseline for anybody. There's no organization. So what climate change is increasingly throwing up is this challenge to everyone that we are uncertain about whether we're going to be in this far left end or the far right end or somewhere in between. So, you know, it is a challenge for planning and strategy development, but this is where the tool of scenario analysis is very helpful, which is, you know, a structured way to work through multiple different scenarios and then think about how to improve the business model and strategy as a result. So there won't be a one sort of baseline idea at all, but what we do have in our guidance on sector level scenario analysis as well is some guidelines and guide rails around the kinds of assumptions that we think are useful to use at the 1.5 degrees end, and then the greater than 3 degrees end as well, as, you know, basically some suggested assumptions to make use of working the way down the cone. Oh, sorry, you're on mute still, Amelia.
Thank you. Another one on scenario analysis. So is there a list of sector level working groups available?
We do not have one publicly on our website. I mean, the only issue with a kind of a list is that the one I showed just earlier is based on our understanding, and there may very well be other conversations going on within sectors we're not fully across. We're doing our best to be connected to that. So basically, once we send these slides out, you'll be able to make use of that list, but there's nothing else. If entities would find it useful, definitely something for you to reach out and let us know that if we can provide more information on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So feel free to contact the team. Our email address is at the end. It's climate@xrb.gov.nz, and we're happy to put you in touch with the people that we know are working on this. So, question here, Jack, on financial impacts. I would like clarity of how the XRB will compel climate reporting entities to integrate/translate climate risks and opportunities into core financials published to the public and to the market. So it's a really tricky one, this question of financial impacts and how it integrates with the financial statements. What we're doing at the XRB is we are going to be publishing some guidance for climate reporting entities on how to understand the integration of climate risks and opportunities required by the climate-related disclosure standards as it relates to the requirements published by the International Accounting Standards Board on the disclosure of climate-related risks and opportunities into financial statements. So for the fact of you would like clarity, we're working on that really hard behind the scenes. There's a lot of work been going on at an international level. We're doing work at a domestic level. So we are intending to publish some guidance next year for climate reporting entities. But if you're interested in how we're going on that, please again contact the team. But it is a very live issue. There's lots going on. Anything else you want to add to that answer, Jack?
Sure, yeah, I think it's a good answer. I would just add that, you know, the way that the framework here is being set up is really to encourage a exploration of the plausible climate-related impacts on the transition and physical side. And that does take a bit of time and energy to explore what's plausible and what the impacts could be, starting primarily qualitatively and then building in quantification from there. So we are trying to encourage a more qualitative starting point than jumping straight to having to worry about the detailed financial impact disclosures in quantified terms. And we think that that's, it's a bit of a new muscle for entities to be building and exercising before they get into that, financial impact type work.
Thanks, Jack. We just had a comment that, yes, entities would find it useful to have more information on how to join a sector working group. So that's good feedback for us. We'll see if we can put something on our website about it, maybe a contact form, and we can get involved in that. So we have a question on, a couple of questions on the transition planning aspect. What is the timing for the additional guidance on transition plans, please?
So we're working on it at the moment. I mean, we'd love to get it out as soon as possible, but there's a lot of guidance already out there. So we're effectively, with our guidance, trying to direct entities to, okay, so if you're a corporate in Australasia, you should probably start with the investor group on climate change, who have laid out their expectations for what goes into a transition plan. There's also the TCFD guidance and guidance coming through from other important international entities. So, what we're also doing in the background is working on this integration more of the adaptation side, and these worlds are colliding a little bit in terms of the mitigation side and the adaptation side. They're increasingly coming together as everyone wants to see an integrated approach to climate change. So we can't make any real promises about exactly when it will be out, but if early next year would be the rough answer to that.
And a question of what is in place to assess how companies stay true to their transition plans? Great question about greenwashing there.
Yes, that's a very good question. There's existing legislation in New Zealand which relates to false and misleading claims. So that's obviously relevant for this area, is that, there are now important claims being made in transition plans. We think about this Volkswagen type example about what they are doing, say with fundamental transformational changes to their business model and strategy. So if they were to be making these kinds of claims and they're not actually doing it, we have existing legislative protection in place in New Zealand and effectively around the world, which, the regulator can take enforcement action on as they, deem fit based on their approach in this area. So, there is already, strong rules, which is that you can't make misleading or false claims. And so I think that combined with basically the ambition that is effectively inherent in meeting a 1.5 degrees, emissions reduction target for an individual entity really sets it up, as a pretty strong mechanism. But there is going to, I think, be other global moves and conversations going on about what further protections may be needed, because there is this concern in the market at the moment that, these claims may be being made around what entities are going to do to reduce emissions kind of in advance of or absent these kind of credible transition plans. So, it's going to be, I think, only ramping up in terms of what's going on in this area in terms of protections.
Thanks, Jack. We got a question. Are these standards, guidance, etc., aligned with each other? So for transition or physical risk assessment, is it enough for business just to follow the XRB standard? So basically a question there about, what an entity needs to follow and how do they use guidance in this area?
Yeah, good question. We could almost kick that one a little bit to Steph later on, who's going to talk about the guidance that we've developed. But, we've tried to basically develop guidance in a way where we're signposting what's already existing, helping entities to navigate what is quite a busy space with lots of other documents. And we've tried to fill in gaps and elaborate where we think that, elaboration adds value. But we're certainly, not wanting to be the only game in town, because, we're not the only game in town. We've developed this whole regime on the back of our starting point being the TCFDs, recommendations and guidance, which, really do go hand in glove. So we think it's important that when it comes to this regime, you're thinking about, okay, the standards, XRB guidance, also the other standards, so Nzcs 2 and CS3, but that, our guidance is basically also a way to help navigate what already exists.
Yeah, thank you. And then also, I think a really important point, and when Steph will explain this a bit later as well, the standards have the mandatory disclosure requirements for climate reporting entities. If you are a climate reporting entity, you must follow these disclosure requirements. The guidance is there, XRB guidance, to help you, prepare as when making the disclosures. And we have, as Jack says, used really based on TCFD. And we've got a really good challenge here, Jack. So about the baseline question. So failing to set a baseline for comparative analysis, that seems like a mistake. So I think maybe here we could explain, we could talk a bit more about, why we think setting those those specific temperature outcomes does result in some consistent assumptions that helps that comparative analysis to take place.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I really appreciate this question. So, maybe the point I'm trying to make is effectively, we've often in this sort of world context, had a base case, BAU, what does BAU look like? And then everything that we do in terms of analysis is the deviation from a baseline. I think what climate change does is really makes it difficult to have that one base case, given we could go in quite divergent, different directions as a global community. And so that's just the fundamental challenge. In terms of what we're doing in this regime, we do have, we think, pretty extensive guidance in there, starting with the sector level scenario analysis about if you're going to do use a 1.5 degrees scenario, which is required by the standard, then here are the types of assumptions that we think would be basically our suggestion for what to start with. And then also on the higher physical risk end, we have suggestions there. And really it's based around this NGFS architecture, which is important globally, so that there's some degree of understanding of when we're talking orderly, disorderly, hothouse, people can, more easily understand what types of scenarios these are and what assumptions are being made. So, we think that's as far as we can go, and before we start to get into the space of making requirements which are not meaningful anymore for an individual entity. So say with these marine sector scenarios or the insurance sector scenarios, if you look at what's in there, they're very specific to the insurance world or the marine world. They're not, it's very difficult to sort of say, here's the scenario for everyone to use. So we think it's as far as we can go is guidance on the kinds of assumptions that we think are best for entities to then make use of. But as Amelia's pointed out, we are in the process of consulting. We're keen for feedback on that. We want to hear how you're going on the ground, trying to get on top of scenario analysis. So feedback, always welcome.
Thanks, Jack. And one last one on scenario analysis in the strategy section, which is how can we validate the scenario's relevance to a company?
It's a good point. So maybe just on how we're seeing the sector level scenario analysis to play a role. So we see that as doing some important work to bring this global and national level context down to a sector level. And then we think once those sector level scenarios are in play, entities will be able to basically draw those down, but then go through a process, and this is the most important process for the purpose of meeting the standard, of actually doing scenario analysis at their individual entity level. So there could be a case where when the individual entity looks at a sector level scenario, they say, we want to make changes to this to make it more relevant to us. And we think that is something we would encourage. And the sector level scenarios then, basically brings a reference point so that everyone can say, well, here's where we started and here's what we've built from. But, entities in one sector will see the world differently and we'll see the transition differently. So definitely encourage that type of exploratory work. The nature of this is supposed to be a creative process that helps you to, basically break out of the cycle a little bit, think transformationally, think long-term, think about how the world could plausibly change, and then have a conversation about how could we improve our business model and strategy to be more resilient in the case of these multiple scenarios. So not sure if I fully answered the question. I know the question was sort of about then validation. So, I think one thing we're also trying to do is to really encourage a pretty broad church type of process to play out at the sector level, where you have people like climate scientists and data providers in the room, so that you're, got some expertise in this area, people who can say, yes, we think that these scenarios are as useful as they can be, and make proper use of the existing climate science, and then entities can use them from there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jack. And one question that I will take on, which is there an intention to broaden the definition of climate reporting entities to include smaller entities in the future? And if so, what is the possible timeframe? So who is in the regime is set by legislation. That is a government decision. It is not a decision made by the XRB. The Climate Change Commission did recommend to the government that they have another look at who is required to make climate-related disclosures. But that was mostly things around other large non-listed entities or the public sector. So we understand that the government is looking into this. And they will be making some decisions around any potential expansion to the scope of climate reporting entities, probably sometime next year. But at the moment, we do not understand that there is any intention to expand it to smaller entities at the moment. All right, thank you, Jack. That was a brilliant session. Lots of questions for you. So please keep, we've got a couple of questions I'm holding in reserve for the relevant sections. But now we're going to go back over to Lisa to talk about risk management.
Okay, thank you very much, Amelia. So we'll just quickly go through the risk management section. The objective of the risk management disclosures is to enable primary users to understand how an entity's climate-related risks are identified, assessed, and managed, and how those processes are integrated into existing risk management processes. Primary users want to know their entities have robust risk management processes in place. It is important to note that these disclosures are focused on climate-related risks and on the processes and not the outcome. This section contains 2 overarching disclosure requirements, one of which has sub-disclosures. There are 5 proposed disclosure of sub-disclosures under the climate-related management processes. Next slide. So you'll see we've basically the sub-disclosures here. The first one's focusing on the tools and methods used. These are a significant contributing factor for a primary user in determining whether an entity identifies and assesses climate-related risks robustly. Some examples would be scenario analysis, stakeholder engagement, hazard maps, etc. We then move on to an explanation of the time horizons considered. And a primary user would expect a coherent approach to these time horizons here and also in the strategy section that Jack has just talked through. We have a requirement to a sub-disclosure on the parts of the value chain that are excluded. I'll just briefly mention that Nzcs 3, our general requirement standard, has a requirement that an entity considers the exposure of its value chain when considering its exposure to climate-related risks and opportunities. And following feedback from our consultation, we have actually changed this disclosure to be the parts of the value chain that are excluded rather than what we had last time, which was a disclosure of the entire value chain. We then also have frequency of assessment, so obviously reviewing and revision on a regular frequency to maintain relevance of your risk management processes, and then how those climate-related risks are prioritised. And this is just I guess we've streamlined this disclosure from what we previously had. The second overarching disclosure requirement requires an entity to describe how climate-related risks identification, assessment, and management is integrated within your existing processes and practices. So that is a short but sweet, I guess, overview of the risk management disclosures. And it is about disclosing your actual processes to your primary users.
Thanks, Lisa. We do have a question on this. So could you please give some clarity around risk assessments and integration? Most organisations are aligned to ISO 31000 for risk assessment, which uses, now it says C times L, I'm not quite sure what that is. This can't be used for a climate risk assessment, which uses the IPCC best practice of hazard times exposure times vulnerability. The 2 assessments are very different due to the characteristics of climate risk. It requires a shift in risk culture and understanding of climate risk assessment in the organisation, which takes time. Please provide some guidance, especially if the purpose is to operationalise climate risks within the organisation.
I can see he's put his camera on.
Yeah, I thought I'd jump in there, Lisa. That's consequence and likelihood and hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. So that's that IPCC versus the kind of standard kind of climate or non-climate risk analysis. I totally hear that, and we've decided to pull that out into some very targeted guidance, so that will be coming along further on the track. But at the moment, we've taken it out of the main body of guidance. So we are hoping to get there, and we've taken this sort of TCFD approach, which is basically just tell us about the types of risk management processes that you currently have in play, rather than prescribing what we think that those should be at the moment.
Thank you, Steph. So yeah, so as with the governance disclosures, a key reminder, a lot of these disclosure requirements are disclosure requirements. They're asking, what is happening in your entity. Please provide an example, description of what is going on, and that provides really useful information to primary users when they're looking across investment options. So we've got no other questions on risk management at this point. So just a reminder, if you do have any questions, you can have a look at the basis for conclusions on why we came to where we did on the proposed disclosure requirements relating to risk management. And Steph will talk again at the end about the guidance that we have. All right, so moving on now over to Judy for metrics and targets.
Ngā mihi, Amelia, tēnā koutou. So metrics and targets is where an entity's greenhouse gas emissions are disclosed. Next slide, please, Amelia. Thanks. As well as other metrics and targets. And assurance is required over the greenhouse gas emissions disclosures from October 2024 onwards. The objective for disclosing metrics and targets information is to allow primary users to better assess the entity's potential risk-adjusted returns, general exposure to climate-related issues, and progress in managing or adapting to those issues. These disclosures should be about describing the metrics and targets that are used to manage your climate-related risks and opportunities. They should be informed by your governance, strategy and risk management processes, and they should create a feedback loop over time in the same way that your other key performance indicators and key risk indicators are used to inform your business management processes. The proposals require disclosure of cross-industry metrics. These are considered to be relevant to all businesses regardless of their industry and business model. I'll cover those cross-industry metrics in more detail shortly. The proposals require disclosure of relevant industry-based metrics. We aren't proposing to specify these metrics. You can select the industry metrics which you use. If you don't know where to start, I suggest you look at the International Sustainability Standards Board, who have picked up the SASB standards and are adapting these for a global context. In addition, if you use metrics for measuring and managing your climate-related performance that fit neither of these categories, you should disclose them. And finally, the proposals also require disclosure of the targets that you are using to measure and manage your climate-related risks and opportunities and the performance against these. And I'll go into this in a bit more detail too. We've tried to balance principles-based disclosures, providing flexibility for entities, along with prescriptive disclosures such as the cross-industry metric categories that provide comparability. So just a little bit about the time horizons for metrics. There are 3 time horizons that are relevant: current, historical, and forward-looking. So current is obviously the most recent reporting period and should be the same period as your current financial statements. Historical data is for prior periods. So our proposals in NZCS 3 is for 2 years of historic data for comparatives. Of course, if your story, you may wish to include longer. Forward-looking is the future period data, and that covers short, medium, and long-term time horizons. Your forward metrics might be based on methodologies such as scenario analysis, trend analysis, sensitivity analysis, simulations, as well as commitments and your climate-related targets. Your forward-looking metric might be more appropriately reported as a range based on assumptions about the future state of the world, which could be tied to one or more of the plausible climate scenarios you've looked at. It is helpful to disclose your metrics consistently from year to year in order to facilitate comparisons and trend analysis, although we recognise that with this being a newer area, you may change and develop better metrics over time. So the proposals have 8 cross-industry metric categories. These categories are expected to be relevant to all businesses regardless of their industry and business model. Note that these are categories rather than individual metrics to allow some flexibility in reporting while retaining consistency. NZCS 3 has that requirement for the 2 years of comparatives for all metrics, and we have optional exemptions for comparatives. None in the first year and only 1 year of comparatives in the second, or and a 2-year exemption for analysis of trends if you would like that. Next, I'll run through the more detailed requirements for greenhouse gas emissions and examples from each of the other categories. So the proposals are for disclosure of gross greenhouse gas emissions. This means that entities should report emissions before any trades, credits or removals are applied. This includes accounting for your Scope 2 emissions using the location-based methodology and reporting any of your removals separately. We believe this is a transparent approach which will focus attention on emission reductions rather than offsetting and help to avoid allegations of greenwashing. If you are using the market-based emissions methodology for setting in targets or as an internal metric, you would also disclose your emissions using this methodology. There are some additional requirements around the proposed greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. Nzcs 1 is primarily a disclosure rather than measurement standard, and we recognise there are existing globally accepted and commonly used emissions measurements and reporting standards, which include the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and ISO 14064-1. Therefore, we aren't proposing to mandate a single approach or standard that you use, but instead propose the disclosure of the standard or standards that you have used to measure your emissions. We've also not required a particular consolidation approach. While the choice of the consolidation approach can move your emissions between scopes, we believe that with the inclusion of Scope 3, the total emissions disclosed will be similar, irrespective of the consolidation approach applied. However, you will need to disclose which consolidation approach you used. In addition, you'll also need to disclose any exclusions and justify why they have been excluded. This is important as it enables primary users to see the gaps, if any, in your emissions measurement. You'll note that we have dropped the requirement for an entity to prepare and publish a greenhouse gas emissions report in accordance with the recognised standard. This was in response to feedback from the consultation that you could meet the proposed disclosure requirements without preparing an emissions report. However, an entity will need to have sufficient internal records available for assurance practitioners when these disclosures are subject to assurance. There is a 1-year exemption or an optional 1-year exemption for the disclosure of Scope 3 emissions. And one final point, there are proposed requirements in Nzcs 3 for the disclosure of methodologies, assumptions and uncertainty in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. This is particularly important when it comes to your Scope 3 emissions, as there is generally a much greater level of uncertainty associated with these, and the results that, or the quantity of emissions that you disclose may differ drastically depending on the methodology that you use. A reminder of what's included in Scope 3. It's the full value chain, upstream and downstream. That's the yellow arrows in this diagram. This is beyond the business travel waste, T&D losses and freight that has been common practice in New Zealand to date. Depending on your business, you might find that emissions arising from purchased goods and services, capital goods and use of sold products are many times greater than the emissions you're currently disclosing. Why are we so fixed on Scope 3? It's really important. For most entities, this is where your most significant emissions risks and opportunities lie. And it's important that the entity and primary user understand these risks and opportunities. This diagram is from the Carbon Disclosure Project, and its 2021 analysis indicated that a given company's Scope 3 emissions averaged around 11 times higher than its direct emissions. Measuring Scope 3 can help you assess where the emissions hotspots are in your supply chain. It can help you identify resource and energy risks in the supply chain. It can identify energy efficiency and cost reduction opportunities in your supply chain or in your products. It can engage suppliers and assist them to implement sustainabilities. And very, very, very importantly, it can help you build this knowledge into your transition planning. Now, let's dive into some examples for the other cross-industry metrics. The following examples have been sourced from the TCFD guidance material. So intensity ratios express the greenhouse gas impact per unit of physical activity or unit of economic output. You might use a physical intensity ratio when aggregating or comparing across businesses that have similar products. For example, this example is the grams per kilowatt hour, or you might have the example of tons of CO2e per washing machine. You might use an economic intensity ratio when aggregating or comparing across businesses that produce different products. For example, tons of CO2e per $1 million revenue or similar. Entities can be vulnerable to several types of climate-related transition risks. Jack covered them as well: policy and legal risks, which reflect changes in policy and litigation action; technology risks, as emerging technologies impact the competitiveness; market risks from changes to supply and demand; and reputational risks tied to changing customer or community perceptions. This disclosure allows users to better understand the potential financial vulnerability regarding these issues, such as possible impairment or stranding of assets, effects on the value of assets and liabilities, and changes in demand for products and services. This next disclosure around physical risks allows users to better understand potential financial vulnerability regarding issues of impairment and stranding of assets, value of assets and liabilities, and cost of business interruptions. When considering the types of climate-related physical risks that you might be vulnerable, you need to consider both acute risks, storms, floods and wildfires that are event-driven, and the chronic risks such as higher temperatures and sea level rise that refer to longer-term shifts in patterns. Physical risks will be specific to the geography where the asset or activities are located and their likely exposure or vulnerability to that risk. For example, certain assets might be more vulnerable to acute risks from storms or wildfires, where others could be more at risk from chronic changes in average temperatures, such as sea level rise or drought. This disclosure provides insight into the position of entities relative to their peers and allows users to understand likely transition pathways and potential changes in revenue and profitability over time. There are several categories of climate-related opportunities that entities can capture. And some of the examples are improved resource efficiency from reducing energy, water and waste, use of energy sources that emit low or no greenhouse gas emissions, development of new products and services, access to new markets, and improved adaptive capacity and resilience. And you'll note that these last few tie very closely to the strategy stuff that Jack was talking about earlier. In addition to having different climate-related risks and opportunities, entities differ in the extent to which they're deploying capital to meet their risks and increase their opportunities. This capital investment disclosure gives an indication of the extent to which long-term enterprise value might be affected. We're looking for deployment of capital in low emission technologies, business lines or products that may demonstrate that you're investing to make your business resilient to transition or risk or capture climate-related opportunities. For example, entities that are hardening infrastructure in response to increased incidents of physical risks can signal that short-term debt might increase as the entity upgrades the assets, but long-term costs might be lower. Internal emissions pricing is a mechanism by which entities can put a value on their greenhouse gas emissions to facilitate analysis of the actual and potential impacts of the climate-related risks and opportunities. For example, you might use an internal emissions price to understand the potential future costs associated with developing new emissions-related assets. The disclosure of internal emissions prices can help primary users identify which entities have business models that are vulnerable to future policy changes, policy responses to climate change, and which are adapting their business models to ensure resilience to transition risks. While internal emissions prices can take a variety of forms and amounts, an increasing number of companies are setting an internal notional or actual price on the amount of greenhouse gas emissions emitted from assets and investment projects, so they can see how, where and when their emissions could affect their strategy, their P&L statements and investment choices. Remuneration policies are important incentives for achieving your goals and objectives and may provide insight on your governance, oversight and accountability for managing climate-related issues. The ways in which you link executive compensation to performance on issues related to climate change will be specific to you and your governance structure. Some entities choose to report the percentage of the executive's pay linked to climate considerations, while others discuss weighting factors or the total amount of compensation that could be impacted. Right now, I want to talk about the targets. A climate-related target refers to a specific level, threshold, quantity, or qualitative goal that you want to meet over a defined time horizon to address your risks and opportunities. They should be aligned with your strategy and risk management goals. They should be linked to the relevant metrics, and they should be quantified and measurable. So the few other requirements in here, they should identify the base year against which you'll measure progress. And the Ideally, the timeframe of targets would be coherent across all targets and, if feasible, consistent with key dates tracked by international organisations such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or regulators, for instance, the Net Zero by 2050 New Zealand target. The interim target is just a checkpoint between the current period and the target end date, particularly when it's a long or medium term target. And for instance, if you have a 2050 target, we would expect that you may have interim targets at 5 to 10 year intervals. The interim targets allow you to adjust your strategy and adjust your performance and change your plans if required. So this next example is cited by CDP in their Good Practice Handbook. This is from NL, and they provide a summary in their annual report which demonstrates how their different climate targets contribute to their overall net zero commitment. The timeframe, scope and scenario applicable to each target is clearly stated. They've also reported whether or not it has been SBTI certified. The other aspect of this disclosure format is that specific actions that will be taken to achieve each of the targets is clarified, with some detail provided on the capital investment that is planned to support their achievement. So this kind of demonstrates that NL is integrating their net zero commitment into their wider financial and strategic planning. The proposed disclosures that the entity discloses the targets that it uses, and many of you will have experience setting targets for gross emission reductions or emissions intensity. This slide I just put up to show example targets for other cross-industry metrics, and it's been drawn from the TCFD guidance if you wanted to expand the range of targets you are using to measure and manage your climate-related risks and opportunities. The final section of the NZCS 1 standard is assurance. The legislation states that the greenhouse gas emissions must be assured for periods ending on or after 27th of October 2024, and we are proposing limited assurance. The assurance engagement will cover the disclosed Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, the additional requirements around the standard used, consolidation approach and exclusions, as well as the methodologies, assumptions and uncertainty disclosure requirements from Nzcs 3. So Amelia, are there questions for metrics, targets and assurance?
There are. All right, we had a question waiting very patiently from very early on, which is, if you already have an auditor for your greenhouse gas disclosures that is different from your financial statement auditor, and all your climate related disclosures are outside the financial statements, is your financial statement auditor required to do anything and therefore charge additional fees?
So I can't speak to the charging. So if you are having in your annual report, it's my understanding, I'm not a super expert assurance practitioner. For your financial statements, if they're contained within an annual report, I think your financial auditor is already required to make sure that there's nothing inconsistent with your statements. The XRB will have a standard that your greenhouse gas emissions must be assured in compliance with. That's under development at this point in time. So assuming that your greenhouse gas emissions, your current greenhouse gas emissions assure fits that XRB standards, I think you should be okay, she says. I think they just have to make sure that they're not inconsistent and that there's nothing problematic there. But there would be a conversation to have with your financial auditor.
And if anyone in the audience is interested in staying up to date with the assurance work that's happening at the XRB around greenhouse gas emissions, and you're not already receiving, things like Pito Pito Kororo, which is our newsletter, or you're not already receiving our mail outs around webinars like this, please do contact us. That's climate@xrb.gov.nz, and we'll make sure you're added to the list for any future webinars, especially on greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so some great, very specific questions here for you, Judy. What is the expected level of methodology disclosure for financed emissions, noting that these disclosures will likely rely highly on assumptions and sector-specific emissions factors by revenue due to lack of client-specific emissions and financial data?
That's a great question. So I think the key is here that this is a disclosure regime. So if you're putting a number out there, you need to let your users understand how solid or otherwise that number is. And we recognise that a lot of those Scope 3 emission sources, particularly financed emissions, are scratchy. but they still provide useful information. And so it is really important that the disclosure requirements around your methodologies and analysis is pulled out. It needs to be, you may wish to sort of separate like super supporting material off slightly to one side so that you can give your high level disclosures into one place, but that's your choice for presentation. Enough that the primary user can understand how to interpret the numbers that you have published.
Thanks,
Does that
Judy.
answer that question, I hope?
Yeah, I think so. And yeah, just a reminder, we do have location of disclosures requirements in Nzcs 3. They do enable cross-referencing, but as Judy said, you know, they've got to make sure that it is coherent and enable the primary user to understand. So again, 3 standards read together as a package. Hopefully that answers the question. And another one, which is, does the XRB have any insight on how emission factors by revenue that are specific to New Zealand might evolve and be made publicly available to allow entities to disclose financed emissions in a consistent way?
The short answer is no. It would be good if they did, but I think they will be some time away. There are consumption-based emission factors that Motu developed in 2013 or 14, and there has been some work looking to renew those or update those, but nothing published yet officially. And yeah, revenue-based, I think it's just a matter of time. They will come. The quality of information available due to all of the regimes, not just ours, that are coming into place in the world, the data quality will get better, but there's no specific plans for New Zealand stuff at this point, as far as I'm aware.
Thanks, Judy. And then another question, which is going back to the NL, is that how you say it, Judy? Example, you mentioned that it shows that the plan shows that the financial perspective is included in their strategy. Is that enough for the XRB as a probe of embedding financial perspectives within the plan? Now, I will just jump in there for a very quick answer. The XRB sets the standards. It is the FMA that regulates the scheme. So XRB is not going to come along and tell you, you know, whether your climate related, whether your climate statements or group climate statements, you know, tick past the standards. That is the job of the regulator. But I'll hand over to you, Judy, for any other bits on this.
Oh, and the only other thing I was going to mention this, so that's an example from TCFD best practice. So that's the TCFD disclosure regime, which is voluntary. So you would want to compare how that compares to our proposed requirements, which are very close. They're not 100 miles apart, but just recognizing that that's a voluntary, and there's been a lot of liberal interpretation for people disclosing against the TCFD and choosing the bits that they wish to disclose against. So I'm not saying that that is the perfect response, but it's worth looking at, and it's worth the TCF. So that was CDP that did a best practice handbook. You might want to have a look at what they think, but be cautioned, it is against the TCFD rather than our disclosure requirements.
Thanks, Judy. Now, that was the last one for you. I've got one more that I'll take on. So, which is, given the New Zealand banking sector is captured by the standards, do you expect that they will require key clients to disclose in alignment to the standards, even if they're not a reporting entity? How rigid do you expect bank requirements to be? And is there sector guidance coming in this area? So, lots to answer on that question. So, firstly, yes, we do expect that banks will probably over time be looking to get some of the information that they need for their disclosures from entities. I think, you know, ANZ has publicly come out and said something similar to this. However, there is no obligation from XRB standards, from Aotearoa New Zealand standards, that can compel an entity to require information off its suppliers. There's nothing in the standard. However, any entity may wish to, as part of its own financial decision making or its own contractual arrangements, to compel information, as you know, you might expect in any commercial arrangement. How rigid do we expect banks' requirements to be? I don't know, that's something that will happen over time, but I mean, a really important message that we have been saying for a long time is that we do expect at least greenhouse gas emissions information to be a really fundamental piece of organisational information. So if you're an organisation out there, you're not already starting to measure your emissions, I really highly encourage you to do so because, yeah, over time, even if you're not a climate reporting entity, you are probably in the value chain of a climate reporting entity at some point. And then finally, is there sector guidance coming in this area? So we are definitely intending to put out guidance for banks in terms of how they disclose against NZCS 1 and 2. But that is not going to be particularly related to this issue of capturing emissions down their value chain. That is a decision for the banks to use. Anything else you want to add, Judy, on that question?
No, that's very well answered. Thank you, Amelia.
Great. Okay, that's it for metrics and targets. And now we're going to move on to our last bit, which is staff guidance.
Thanks, Amelia. So it's now time for a cheeky little half pike with what we hope is a lower degree of difficulty as we move into the guidance phase of the deep dive session. And I thought we should start that with a quick overview of the XRB staff guidance documents that you can call on now or you can expect to see in the future. So we've previously published sectoral scenario analysis guidance, fact sheets on scenario analysis and measuring your emissions, and a director's preparation guide. And all of that is available from the resources section of the XRB website. In July, we published guidance for all sectors and sector-specific guidance for MIS managers. And we've also have sector-specific guidance for banks, as we were just speaking about there, and insurers, both in development, along with some targeted guidance for scenario analysis at entity level and for transition planning as well. So what we want to focus on today are the two documents that were published in July along with the exposure draft. So as you probably caught on from the tenor of this discussions, these guidance documents they're live, they're working drafts. So we're very keen to have your feedback on them, see what you make of them, and let us know what you would like to see changed. I'll now explain a little bit about our approach to the development of the guidance and its structure and the nature of its content. So we set about the process of guidance development with three core objectives. Our first objective is to deepen understanding of climate-related risk and opportunity. So the regime isn't about tick box compliance, it's about improving the information that's available to investors, and in doing so, improving the resilience of disclosing entities to climate-related risk. Our second objective is to illustrate prime user needs. And we've tried to illustrate as clearly as possible for preparers what the needs of prime users are, because we're hoping with that information will help clarify for preparers how they could approach the disclosure in the most useful way. And finally, we're trying to build some consistency, and we're aiming to do that primarily via enhancing preparers' understanding, both of climate-related risk and opportunity and primary user needs, but also through building transparency and coherence in the methods and approaches that we're describing. So let's dive into an example. This is an example of the guidance accompanying disclosure 13B regarding climate-related risks and opportunities. Now you see that it opens with an explanation of primary user perspectives. It then goes on to describe an approach that can be used, taken to use to go at the disclosure. It signals that first-time adoption relief is available, and it highlights some useful external resources. A lot of those are TCFD. This regime was developed at a time when TCFD was kind of the North Star of most of the disclosure world. There are other disclosure guidance documents that are now coming into play as well, and we're trying to link to those as coherently as possible. But finally, it also provides an illustration of how entities could disclose. And this is the typical structure and content of the guidance documents that you're going to encounter. So please let us know what you make of that approach and that sort of structure and content framing. And let us know what, if anything, you'd like to see done differently as we continue to develop both these guidance documents and all the other guidance documents that are in the pipeline. Thank you.
Right, we've just got one question come in on the draft guidance, which is, in terms of the insurance guidance, will you differentiate between general insurers and life health insurers in recognition of the different types of risks that they are exposed to?
Let's go with yes at this stage. I think that's one of the things that we need to do, and working on the guidance that we've developed so far, a lot of it is quite a collaborative, consultative kind of approach that needs to be taken to working out exactly what the guidance landscape needs to be. So a tentative yes, I think, would be the case to that.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so that is the end of our deep dive. We'd like to remind you we have 2 more deep dive sessions. So we have one specific for our financial institutions, and that's tomorrow. And then we've also got our MIS managers one next week. So you can register for these on our website. If you just click on the events tab, and they will also be recorded and be on our website, and the PowerPoints will also go up. In our main consultation document, which is the overarching and kind of umbrella document, we have 6 main consultation questions. These focus on user needs, primary user needs, the practicality of preparing required disclosures, first-time adoption provisions, and draft staff guidance. Excuse me. All right, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. My apologies, which I will just try and get to those now in the time that we've got left. So, how do you expect the standards to be updated, modified, tightened over time? Noting that everyone seems to be learning by doing at the moment. That's a great question. So what the XRB has decided is that we will do a post-implementation review quite early for this disclosure regime. We've committed to beginning that by December 2025. That means that we will have at least 1.5 years of disclosures that we can look at, and we will understand at that point whether we need to be more prescriptive in terms of some of the disclosure requirements, whether we need to add or take away, or align further with what's happening internationally. So yes, we do expect that there will be some movement, but we do want to give entities the chance to get started on disclosures before we make any changes. Now, Judy, I've got a question for you. For use phase emissions, which are future emissions, our carbon footprint auditor has not been able to provide assurance. They provide verification for that portion of Scope 3, while the remainder of our Scope 3 is classed as reasonable. What level of assurance is expected for use phase emissions if this cannot be easily assured?
So the standard will say limited assurance for all of your emissions. And I just want to clarify, I think if your assurance practitioner is using the ISO standard, they do verification for backwards and validation for forward-looking emissions, which is those use phase. And I think I've got those 2 the right way around. I may have them the wrong way. So they verification is assurance. In the accounting world, there is one standard 3410, and they don't differentiate between forward-looking and backward-looking emissions. So the XRB interim standard that we are working on developing will probably call both of those and is aiming to combine ISO practitioners and existing 3410 practitioners and combine them both. So my short answer is I think you will be able to get assurance. It is limited. That's the proposal for all of the emissions at the moment. And although it's not strictly ISO to call that little section assurance, it will be considered assurance for this part of the regime. And they will be doing some validation. Your current provider is doing some validation over that for you anyway. Hopefully that answers that, Nick. Yeah.
Okay, and so a reminder, the consultation closes on the 26th of September, and we need submissions in by this date so that we are able to issue the final standards in December. So thank you so much for your attention, for your questions. Please do contact the team if you have any further questions. Have a look on our website for all the documents, all that guidance, etc. that Steph talked about, and we will be putting this up on our website as well. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you to the team for presenting, and we'll look forward to getting any submissions in that you may wish to share. Thank you.